Okay, number 107, mediumship, weird and unexplained. That's the subject of today's video. As always, please like it, click the subscribe button, and all that good stuff. It helps other people to see these videos. So I've decided to do some videos, not necessarily more than one video, but not all of them necessarily in a row. But I am going to number them, weird and unexplained, number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. And basically, I'm going to talk about weird shit that has happened to me that is not related to mediumship, but it is strange, if not outright paranormal. If you're a medium, you probably have stories to share that are weird like that, that aren't about mediumship, but they're certainly out there. And I would like to know. So if you're not comfortable commenting below, shoot me an email, even if you have to make up a Gmail account and tell me that way. I'm really interested in hearing other people's strange stories. And I get being reluctant because it's taken me years to get comfortable with just saying stuff like this, because it is super weird. So stuff has happened to me my whole life. And so this is where I differ from most people. I don't assign explanations to things, but I'm also not willing to say that something didn't happen. That's where I sit with these kinds of experiences. And that's frustrating to some people, because I have talked privately with a lot of people about a lot of these experiences. And I've come across people who want to say, oh, that's definitely poltergeist, or that's definitely aliens, or that's definitely whatever. And I think, well, maybe. I can see why you would say that, but I don't know for sure what these experiences are. When I do these weird and unexplained videos, I have to acknowledge here, I may do it for all of them, but I'll definitely say it here, that one possible explanation for these experiences would be mental health issues on my part. And I've said this in another video, I know for sure, people with actual mental health issues don't function well in society. Often they have really good jobs, but relationship after relationship after relationship, or they have a pretty stable relationship, but they can't keep a job, or both work and personal life suffer. And I've worked at the same really difficult job for the last 15 years, and I've been with the same person, either as legally married as we could be, or legally married for most of my life at this point. So I function well in society. That's all I can say about my own mental health issues. So for this first inaugural weird and unexplained video, I'll just bluntly say, I remember a cousin that nobody else in my family remembers. Or it's probably more correct to say, I remember a version of one of my cousins that nobody else remembers. So here's the story. I grew up mostly in Los Angeles, and lived mostly in Los Angeles, but from the ages of 10 to 14, I moved with my mom to rural Arizona, and that's where we lived. And we'd been there a couple of years, and my mom's cousins, coincidentally, happened to retire to that same small town. They were in between my mom and my grandparents' ages, and they were second or third cousins to my mom, and they were second or third cousins to each other, and they got married. So each, the husband and the wife, were both my mom's cousin. They had a daughter named Kathy. She was about 19 years old to my 12 or 13, and all of them, that whole family, was so kind and generous and funny, and it was always really pleasant going to visit them. Usually we'd go have dinner over at their house, or a very late lunch and stay, on the weekend. Mostly we went for dinner. Anyway, the reason that they bought that particular house in this town was because the previous owner was in a wheelchair, and he had modified the whole house for his wheelchair. There were ramps everywhere, the kitchen counters were lower than normal, and there was a suite in that house where the adjoining bathroom had been modified for someone in a wheelchair. The toilet and the shower were both modified for wheelchair access. And they got that house because one of Kathy's older brothers, she had 3 older brothers, was in a wheelchair. He had been in his early 20s. He had been, I should say, Kathy and I, Kathy was about 19, I was 12 or 13, and my older brothers were in their 20s, and her older brothers, I think one was in his late 20s and the other 2 were in their 30s. So one of those brothers of hers, when he was in his early 20s, was driving a truck, and at the top of a hill, the brakes went out. And instead of jumping out when he could, he rode it down the hill because he didn't want it to run into someone else and kill them. And in the resulting crash, it broke his back, and he ended up in a wheelchair for life. So having this house, his parents buying this house that was modified for a wheelchair, made it much easier for him to come and visit and be totally independent. And they wanted that. So he came to visit I remember him visiting a couple times, but the first time he came to visit, I remember him vividly for these specific reasons. I had never known anyone in a wheelchair. At that point, I was 12, so I, not much life experience. And I come from a huge family, which is why I have first, second, and third cousins. And almost all of the older relatives, certainly the men, were either in World War II or the Korean War or Vietnam. Nobody was disabled. So we really lucked out. But this guy was in a wheelchair. Also, his parents, Kathy's parents, were super proper and very clean cut and very well dressed. And this guy it was the 1970s, had this long 70s shaggy hair, this really gigantic beard. And in the 70s, a lot of men wore their shirts unbuttoned to their navel, and he had this really hairy body. He was just covered in hair. And he was not friendly and nice. And his sister and his parents were really super friendly and super kind. And he was just kind of, I wouldn't call him off-putting, but it was a stark contrast to the other members of his immediate family that I knew. And also, his girlfriend came with him, and she stayed there in that suite with him. Like they were staying for 2 or 3 days. And my mom's cousins were very Catholic, very proper, and this is the 1970s. So I didn't say anything like, she's staying here, but I thought it was strange. And then when we were driving home, my mom said, wow, I'm surprised that they're letting them stay together in the same room. So that's a lot of things to remember, right, about this guy who no one else remembers. So I'm fascinated that I have a cousin in a wheelchair. I used to go to the library after school and wait for my mom to get off work, and then I'd go home with her because we lived way out of town, distance from town, this little town. And my mom worked in the center of this little town. So she'd pick me up at the library and we'd go home. And at the library, I started researching spinal injuries. And I was trying to find like cures and that kind of thing. And the next time we had dinner with Kathy's parents, with this guy's parents, he had left, he and his girlfriend had left. I was telling them about, oh, they can't do this right now, but they're going to be able to do this. And have you tried that? And they had a very, oh, that's so cute attitude. Like they were touched that I was researching his injuries and trying to find ways to make him better, make him able to walk. So all of that. Okay. And then I remember him coming up as a subject in a class I had in high school and a class I had in college, both talking about neurology, about nerves. And I even remember one of those two classes had a video that showed when a spinal cord is severed, when the nerves go to grow back together, instead of joining each other, they turn back on each other. And so the communication, they don't rejoin. And so the communication doesn't happen. And that's why you can't walk when you sever your spine. So I talked about him in classes years later. Okay, so there's that. So when I was in my 20s and Kathy was in her 30s, Kathy died after a long illness. And it was terrible. It was really devastating for her parents because she was their only daughter and their youngest child, and she was really sweet. She was a really nice person. So I thought that it was weird that her brother in the wheelchair was not at the funeral, but I wasn't going to say anything because it was none of my business, and I didn't know if he was in poor health and whatever. So wheelchair guy was not there. Then when I was in my 40s, Kathy's parents died and my mom's cousins died, and they died within 2 or 3 days of each other. So there was a joint funeral for both of them. And I was out of town on a business trip, so I couldn't go. And we had moved back to California, and they always lived at a distance from us. So I never saw them again. I saw them at their daughter's funeral, and that was it. These were not close. I mean, I loved them. They were really kind, but we were not like a close-knit with that particular part of our family. Okay, so a few weeks later, I'm talking to a mutual cousin about the funeral, about Kathy's parents' funeral. And I said, hey, that brother of hers that was in the wheelchair, what was his name? And he's like, what? And then I asked another cousin about that, and he's like, what are you talking about? None of her brothers was in a wheelchair. So we all agree, everyone in the family agrees that Kathy had 3 older brothers, but it turns out that nobody remembers one of them being in a wheelchair. And I've since connected with other mutual family members who are like social media friends with them, and I've seen pictures of all 3 brothers in the last 20 years. No one's in a wheelchair. So that's super weird. Fortunately, my oldest brother does remember the wheelchair modified house. But when I asked him, well, why would they buy a house with lower countertops and modified bathrooms and leave all the ramps everywhere? He says, I don't know, they just did. So That's sort of, I'd be worried, maybe a little bit worried, but for the fact that my brother remembers the wheelchair modified house, because everybody, this was back in the 70s, and everyone's deceased at this point who might have been there except me and my brother. So there's that. Wait, the story doesn't end there. So years later, years after my mom's cousins died, where I found out that they didn't have a son who was in a wheelchair that anyone remembers, I was at the center where I was certified to do Reiki level 1 and 2. And they did all kinds of psychic development stuff there. I don't remember why I was there this one night, but it was when I had first started going there. And people would come and there was like 20 to 45 people usually there at a given session, and people would introduce themselves. And this one woman stood up and she said what her first name was, and that she was really into like parallel universes and alternate realities and stuff like that. And that was her thing. And she laughed because everyone knew that about her. And that situation with this cousin of mine popped into my head. I hadn't thought about him in years. And I thought, I'm going to run this by her. So when everyone in the group broke out into separate tables, that woman was sitting with 2 other people. And I thought, well, I'll join them and I'll make a 4th at that table. So it turns out her last name was Rengel. The 2 people she was with were a married couple she was not related to, also named Rengel. And my cousins, who I've been talking about all this time, were also named Rengel. And I thought, well, I actually said to them, that's not a coincidence. I don't know what to make of that, but that's not a coincidence. And they were interested in the story. They were open to things. Everyone there was open to things like that, but no one had an explanation, and I don't have an explanation. And then one more thing, when I very, very first started to do mediumship development circles, I have over 70 people in spirit, and I hadn't yet made a list of everybody so that I could try to recognize them, because I knew going into it that anybody could come through, and I wanted to be a good sitter, right? So right in the beginning there, this woman, beginner-ish medium, gets this man. He's in a really bad accident. That doesn't kill him. He does end up in a wheelchair. And I remember she said he's one of a family of 4, like 3 in 1. So 3 boys and a girl, or 3 girls and a boy, that kind of thing. And no one can take it. And I'm thinking, no, no, no. And then I remembered the situation from years ago with this cousin of mine that no one remembers. And I said, oh, actually, I think I can't take everything you just said. And the woman running the circle was really, really on top of it about time, because there were so many people. And she said, I'm sorry, that's time. And the other medium said, okay, real quick, I just want to tell you, I'm supposed to say everything in its own time and place. Hope you understand that. I thought, yeah, I understand that, because I've come to think of this as maybe like an alternate timeline. And that's not the explanation I'm settling on, because I don't like to explain things away, but that'll happen. So that was a lot. That is my weird and unexplained story of the cousin that I remember that no one else does, or the version of one of my cousins that nobody else does. It's kind of frustrating, kind of spooky, kind of weird. So that's the first one. If you want more, let me know. Certainly, if you have some weird unexplained story, I want to hear it. I really do. So tell me. I'm really curious, and I'll never repeat it to anyone else if that's your request. And I'm really good about confidentiality. and that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.